narratives, especially social media platforms, that have been playing a big role in amplifying messages while silencing others, and increasing polarization and causing harm. Could you tell us how these tech companies have enabled the spread of misinformation and disinformation in our countries in conflict? And why have things been so much worse in these last few years?
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Misha, and thanks for the organizers for this great event. I think that's a good start, but there's a lot to say about it. So I'm gonna just like make an overview or a brief about what does that mean, and I'm gonna mention or focus on a recent policy brief that we've put together at Digital Action, where we focus about the big tech companies' role in amplifying disinformation and misinformation in conflict areas. I think when we were looking into the issue, and especially after like long time of speaking about like the under enforcement or the over enforcement and suppressing people's voices, we were also looking at the other issues, such as the under enforcement of certain policies, such as the disinformation and misinformation policy, as well as the hate speech policy, which allows the disinformation, or I will be using the term MDM, which is misinformation and disinformation online, allows the MDM to stay on the platforms all the time. And it actually doesn't only stay, it flourishes because people's tendency to share or to reshare disinformation is higher than sharing actual factual content. And for that reason, when you law enforce the policy on hate speech or on disinformation and misinformation, that content stays online, doesn't, like the companies do not take any kind of retroactive measurements to take that down. So technically they are affecting the narrative, they are affecting the archival content that stays online, even for researchers or for the next generations who might be looking into what's going on in Sudan right now, or what's going on in Gaza right now, or even in Lebanon or anywhere else. So with all this law enforcement policy, and with a lot of people speaking about the over enforcement policy for other policies that is censoring people under attack and in conflict places, such as people who are documenting human rights abuses, whether it be in Sudan or in Syria or in Lebanon or even in Gaza, it's like a question about like how the moderation is now letting people or manipulating people when you leave all the disinformation. So you are technically disabling people from accessing rightful or truth and timely information when they need to that. That's like a policy enforcement problem, but on the other hand, we do have other problem, which is a bigger problem. It's the algorithmic amplification for all the disinformation content. When the disinformation stays online, it doesn't just stay naturally online, because how the algorithms is designed, it is amplifying the disinformation, which technically means that it flourishes, it stays there, it also affects people access to information, especially in sensitive times, such as when people are looking for where is the safe place now to go while like there is bombing in certain places, especially in conflict zones. In our policy brief, we looked into in different countries. We looked at Sudan, especially we looked at Al-Kanabi case, where there has been a smearing, disinforming campaign against Al-Kanabi, who are based in Al Jazeera. And in this case, people were accusing them of being like affiliated to RSF or being a spare like human shield for the RSF. And this in our brief, we focused, or we mentioned our partners, Beam Report, who have been working closely on this issue. They have documented cases from 2023 to 2024 where people have been heavily smearing Al-Kanabi. At the beginning of 2025, there has been a lot of attacks on Al-Kanabi, although in some times they have been actually attacked by the RSF. So with all this disinformation, it kind of legitimized the attacking of Al-Kanabi people, where they have been actually smeared, like all the hate speech was mentioned against them. And this is happened because there was no proper content moderation, and there is a law enforcement for all the content that has been smearing them. We've seen similar cases in other places. El Kanabi case happened on X platform, which is now, it's like a messy platform, especially in the past few years. But we've also seen other cases that happened on Meta platform and other cases that happened in TikTok, where in some cases, for example, in TikTok, they permanently suspended an account for a fact-checking organization in Palestine called Kashif, when a fact-checking organization that aims to inform people about what's right and what's wrong is permanently suspended, then that is a question that we need to speak about and what role tech platforms are playing. Other content has been also smearing certain journalists in Gaza Strip, and we've seen a lot of statements from the CPJ and the UN Special Rapporteurs about how those smearing campaigns that use disinforming content against journalists in Gaza Strip are used to justify the killing of journalists in Gaza Strip. However, with all those statements, with all the urges from the international bodies to take down or to moderate that kind of content, it stayed online, and we've seen the consequences of that by targeting different journalists, which one of them was Anas Sharif, who was targeted like a couple of months ago, Al Jazeera journalist, after a huge smear campaign over the past 2 years, led by different Israeli spokesperson. So we're technically speaking about in different cases where disinformation have led to real-world harm, have affected people, whether they are individuals or whether they are communities on the ground in conflict areas, because tech companies have not done any of their job technically. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona, and thank you for giving all of those examples about how messed up things are. And this brings us we're going to try to talk solutions eventually. So this brings me to Justin. As Mona said, what happens online has always had real life impact. We've seen it very clearly these last few years. Could you explain how disinformation, misinformation, the smear campaigns, coordinated online attacks have led to harm on the ground, giving other examples as well, and it gave the legitimization also of targeting individuals or even entire communities on the ground?
Yeah. Does this work? So I want to start off by rewinding a little bit to an example from some years ago. So if we look at Syria under the Assad regime, actually, there was a coordinated smear campaign against the White Helmets, essentially trying to link them to Al-Qaeda. And I think what this did is, while there was still a recognition that the White Helmets were doing important work on the ground, it led to kind of a sort of paralysis in the international community that then allowed the Assad regime to carry on committing crimes and attacking and killing its own population. Today, on the ground in Syria, we're seeing some similar dynamics play out again, where people who maybe oppose the regime are then throwing their weight in fully behind the new government. And I don't think it's like for like, but there's still coordinated campaigns and smearing that's led to attacks on certain communities and certain people in different areas around the country. Of course, Mona mentioned the issues in Gaza with Anas al-Sharif, Hamza al-Dahdouh as well. Different journalists at different times have been linked, dubiously by the Israeli authorities to different militant groups on the ground, PIJ or Hamas or others. And then what it's essentially done is it creates kind of this, what is very clear under international law, but what is, at least in terms of what can lead to any kind of action against Israeli actions or lead to any kind of accountability, it leads to a kind of what people might call like a moral gray space. So essentially nobody wants to act against these people because the Israelis are claiming. And we see that play out in Western media where Israeli claims are always given credence in various articles and news reports, right? We'll see at the bottom, the Israeli authorities claim to X, Y, Z. And what they won't include is often, like Mona said, the CPJ or the other experts who are saying these things are no longer true. So obviously this manifests in a number of different ways. We've also seen it when we talk about this, again, this moral gray space, and I want to be clear, it's not really a moral gray space, right? It's just it creates enough doubt that there's no sort of action by the international community or anybody that can hold these actors accountable. We saw this play out during the Lebanon war as well, Israel's war on Lebanon last year, where, for example, Israel would target certain actors and then say these were Hezbollah members. And for example, they may have been members of the Islamic Health Committee who are first responders, they're medical workers, right? They're not militants, they're not carrying guns, they're not carrying weapons. And under international law, again, they should have full freedom to operate, to move, and to not be targeted. Instead, dozens were killed by direct Israeli attacks, sometimes in double tap strikes as well. So I think all in all, what ends up happening is it creates this sort of ambiguity that then allows people to not take action. That's the common thread between these examples.
Thank you, Justin. I have a question for Bassem now about taking action or not taking action. What are the tools and tactics used by belligerents, actually, to push their own truth and to control their narrative and hide the voices of those who are impacted? Could you give us some additional examples of where these tactics have been used? Are they more common right now than they used to be before? And how is it that perpetrators of abuse and conflict are still able to do such things?
Thank you, Misha. I think it's important to zoom out a bit and think about, some of these tactics that a lot of players in the region, notably Israel, have been doing over the past couple of years. So it's not something new that has been happening in the past couple of years, but it's something that we've been seeing and we've been documenting. However, it is rapidly increasing. We're seeing new tools, we're seeing new tactics. With this advancement of technology, with these new AI tools. So, if we're talking about Palestine, Palestine has been for a year a testing lab for a lot of Israeli technologies. If we're talking about internet shutdowns in Gaza and in Palestine, we need to think about how the internet looks like in Palestine and how the internet looks like in Gaza, even before October the 7th. We know of the Israeli ban on technology upgrades in Palestine, which means that people in the West Bank can access 3G internet and people in Gaza can access 2G internet. So we're already talking about internet that is very slow, that is very unreliable, that is very patchy for a lot of people that have been living there for years. When we're also talking about Sudan, we're talking about the internet shutdowns and how both parties to the war, both the RSF and SAF, have been using control over the telecommunication infrastructure and data centers in different places in the country, to advance their agendas and to advance the narrative and the tactics. But that's something that isn't new. We have seen in 2019 with the Khartoum massacre a prolonged internet shutdown, that when the internet was back on, we saw horrific images and horrific footage of killings and massacres that have been there. Also in 2021 during the protests in Sudan. So these are things that have been happening for years. But over the past couple of years, we're seeing an escalation of these tactics and of these tools, and governments, but also belligerent parties are now more aware of the power of these technologies and the power of these tools. So when we're talking about Gaza, after October the 7th, we've tried to do a mapping of how the internet infrastructure looks like, and the different ISPs that have been impacted. And we found out that 15 out of the 19 ISPs in Gaza, are offline. So we're talking about a huge population in Gaza that have been completely disconnected for months and for weeks in this trip. And also the research and a lot of testimonies show that whenever there is attacks on telecommunication infrastructure, and whenever there is internet shutdown, we're seeing that it is accompanied by military attacks, by airstrikes, and by ground invasion in Gaza. So, yeah, a lot of testimonies that have been coming from Gaza are, talk about the role of the internet, because when we're talking about war, when we're talking about bombs, when we're talking about drone attacks, we rarely think about the internet. But it is becoming more and more important. If you're living under war, the psychological impact is sometimes as heavy as the bombs that are being thrown around you. For people that are trying to access the internet, to find the evacuation zones, to find the safe passages and the safe routes to escape and to take shelter, but they cannot access that. For people that are trying to get aid, they can't access that because of the internet shutdown. And that's also something that is unfortunately happening in Sudan, and you pointed to the atrocities that are happening, to what has been happening in Al-Fashir in the past couple of days. And Sudan is a war that have been silenced by the attacks on journalists and by the communication blackout. So a lot of information and a lot of what is happening on the ground we don't have access to. And we're seeing different alternatives and different tools that have surfaced over the past couple of years. Notably Starlink in Sudan, which has been a lifeline for a lot of people. But also, if we're thinking about Starlink and who's behind Starlink and how problematic the owner of Starlink is, that's another equation, and that's another angle to look at it. Because if you have access to a Starlink dish and you get caught by the RSF, that's that's going to be problematic for you. And with Starlink, operating under like a legal gray area in Sudan, that makes it even more problematic. And I know that Mona talked about content moderation and a lot of censorship that has been happening in Palestine. This has been well documented. If you remember 2021 and Sheikh Jarrah, so that was the turning point of a lot of research and advocacy that has been done to expose some of these policies. But it's not something new. Censorship is not something new. Biometric surveillance in Palestine is not something new. But now we're seeing these lavender and these new technologies and tools that have been deployed by that have been facilitated by AI and the drones that are circulating in Beirut and other areas. So yeah, this rapid militarization of tech is really problematic, and it's something that that has been unfortunately tested and tried on our people, and and then exported to other places and to other conflicts and to other wars to make profit.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I completely agree with you that this is absolutely nothing that is new at all. It's just that, as you said, things have been amplified and happening so much faster, and to a point where even people who aren't tax savvy are seeing the impact of it and seeing how this is being used. Justin, I have a question for you. This is round two. And Qassam started talking about it, about the role of journalists. What should be the role of journalists on the ground? Because it feels like the coverage in several of those countries that we're discussing, Sudan, Gaza, but also Syria and Lebanon, hasn't been top-notch, let's put it this way, to be very diplomatic. What should be the role of those journalists to tackle this war of narrative? Because there's covering events, but there's also this push to have one kind of narrative depending on which country or which area you're covering. How do you go about countering this and to focus and centering the voices of those people on the ground who are being impacted the most? And how do we make sure as journalists that this is reflected in the coverage? Because I know that work sometimes is being submitted and then the end result is different from what is being sent out.
So I think first off, it requires a lot of listening, right? And as a journalist, you have to, I mean, one, you have to listen, and you have to be on the ground, and you have to be meeting with people and hearing what they're telling you, and genuinely listening to them. It also requires being able to identify where power lies. And ultimately our job is to hold power to account, right? So people say there's two sides to every story, and sure, that is true, but if two sides are not equally powerful, we need to look at that disparity of power and then see where that power lies to be able to hold that power to account. Because ultimately the role of journalism in society is to hold power accountable, to keep it honest, so that it serves people, so that it, people can go on and live their lives and live with dignity. So I think that certain narratives have been present, and particularly in Western media. So it's important that journalists look at what happens, cover what happens, but also draw patterns, right? We can't just treat every incident as an individual incident. I remember a certain example, some of you may remember, during Israel's war on Lebanon last year, one of Israel's spokespersons started to announce that there was a hospital in Tahrir where there was underneath it a stockpile of weapons or something to that effect. And so all the media, local media, regional media, international media flocked to this one site. They went underground. The hospital opened their doors and let everybody inspect inside. Nobody found anything. They went back, they reported that. And then the next day, the spokesperson said again, oh, it wasn't right there, it was in like the room next to that or something to that effect. And I remember talking to a journalist who was really frustrated, and who was saying, they're taking us for fools and we have to check it, because if we don't, they can say we didn't. And I kind of pushed back a bit, because I was saying, if it's proven that this person has lied, and there's a pattern of lies, and we can draw that pattern, we can show that pattern, we can point to that pattern with proof, which we can in this case, is it still your responsibility to go check every individual thing when you know that he's playing you? He's doing this to distract you, to take your time, to waste your efforts, to waste your energies, because they know that you have to run after every lead they throw your way. So I think in that sense, we need to recognize patterns, and we need to call out those patterns. Because if it's just an individual incident, again, we're not holding power to account. We're not laying that pattern at the foot of power and saying, this pattern of behavior is leading to different results. So I think that's kind of the most important thing. And I think that, if our job is to hold power to account, then we really have to let the people who are impacted by that power also be our narrators, because they can speak to that better than anybody else. I mean, of course, you speak to analysts, you speak to experts, you speak to consultants, you speak to a wide range of sources, of course, and you build a story based off that. But the people who are living the things that power inflicts upon them are the best narrators. In South Lebanon today, the people who are living through that can tell you what's happening to them better than anybody else can. The people in Gaza can tell you what's happening to them better than anybody else can. So I think it's important to hear them, to listen to them, to visit to them, to give them, to put the camera on them, to lend your words to them. And I think that's ultimately what we can do to hold power to account and to give the most accurate version of the truth that we can.
Thank you, Justin. Qassam, you're next. What can civil society organizations and governmental entities do to make sure that people get access to accurate information that would help them to stay safe in times of conflict? And what can be done when these governments are the perpetrators and are the ones who aren't letting people get this access?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Misha. I think I'll start by the governments, and I think a lot of governments in our region have a responsibility to communicate, then communicate, then communicate. I think whenever there's conflict or whenever there's even political unrest or even any issues that is going on for years, there's a clear lack of communication, and we're seeing more and more how that gap of official communication and official information that is coming from the government lays the ground for a sea of misinformation and disinformation. And we're seeing that get more and more in times of war and in times of conflict, when there is no official narrative and when there is no official information that people can get access to and can learn what is happening, what is not happening, what is the true version and what is not. So that leaves it to local actors, to spread whatever narrative they want, but also that leaves it to other actors, to let's say to Israel or to other parties, to spread misinformation and to spread narratives that basically create confusion and makes it more and more stressful for people on the ground. So governments really have a responsibility to communicate with their people and to communicate with everyone. But there's also the responsibility to have clear guidelines and clear structures when it comes to rules and regulations around data protection, around privacy, around these issues, which is also lacking in our region. And we've seen this a lot in Israel's recent war on Lebanon. The amount of attacks on the data of people in Lebanon. On the different tactics that Israel has been using, from having access to a depository of plate numbers, of phone numbers of people, which basically made them able to send mass SMS and mass messages on WhatsApp or on different platforms to people, that they should surrender or that they should escape this area and this area where there's nothing. It is basically a strategy to create mass fear and mass confusion. So if there's no regulatory framework that is really robust and tries to protect the data and the privacy of people, then that's going to be that makes it even more difficult, and especially in times of war and in times of conflict. But when we're talking about civil society, we really need to acknowledge, how difficult these past couple of years have been to civil society working with our communities in the region, especially with the lack of resources and with the lack of funding. But I don't think any civil society organization has been well prepared to what has happened in the past couple of years. No one has expected the genocide to happen like this and to be at this scale. I'm saying that, but I'm also acknowledging all of the different initiatives that have been taking place. When we're talking about Gaza, a lot of people have came to the rescue, with eSIMs, with different tools to buy SIMs that operate through Egyptian lines or Israeli lines to journalists and to people on the ground to be able to do their work and to connect them to and to get the news out from where it's happening in Gaza. It's not just eSIMs, but it's different mesh networks and it's different strategies. When we're talking about Sudan, I know that there's also a lot of work that has been done by the emergency response rooms on getting people and working with humanitarian actors to get access to Starlink dishes and to satellite connectivity. Especially when we know that the war in Sudan has had a big impact on banking and on cash. So a lot of people in Sudan and people that are living in the diaspora, they would send money to their loved ones in Sudan through their banking app. But when there's no internet and when there's no internet connection, that's something that can basically happen. So there's a lot of initiatives and there's a lot of work that has been done. But I think a learning lesson for us and for a lot of civil society that have been working on this and that are present here in the room and throughout the conference is that we need to keep stock of these tools and to be better prepared in case something like this happens again. We need to have those tools always ready. The different VPNs, the different eSIMs, the different tactics and methods that are easy to share and easy to disseminate with our partners and with people on the ground. But then again, we also need to be prepared of the unknown, and to acknowledge that that reality, that very difficult reality that, you know, sometimes, you know, something can happen and we don't have the technical tools to face it. So, you know, what are we gonna do there? You know, and we need to be more collaborative in terms of, you know, making sure that we don't duplicate efforts. You know, if people are working on that issue, how can we support that work rather than pour our energy and on resources on doing the same thing again?
Thank you, Qassam. And this brings me to my last question for now, to MENA. What is the responsibility of tech companies? I know we can spend hours answering each of those questions and not dig enough, but what is the responsibility of tech companies here and governments too? Since they're working hand in hand sometimes in fighting the spread of harmful narrative in times of conflict. Maybe you could try to think of what can be done now.
Yeah.
And yeah.
If I was asked this question before October 7th, I would have a much concrete answer. Or even if I was asked before the beginning of this year, I would even have a better answer, because over the past years we've been engaging directly but also doing advocacy, and we've actually succeeded with some fellows here in the room to change policies. Like, we've seen the results and the fruits of that. Since the beginning of this year, when Trump administration came into power, it's not like only Twitter is messed up. Like, it's everyone else is messed up. Like, there's nothing as before. It's like all over the place. And even the things that we succeeded and we achieved before, out of a sudden, they undo that. Like the hate speech policy, the disinformation policy, like now under the free speech you can say whatever you want about the hate group or like about women, because you are free to hate women and to spread the hateful narrative just because of free speech. So it's quite shaking to be asked that question now, because it's a very sensitive time, and I know we could still say, oh, we want the tech companies to undo the changes that they've done at the beginning of this year, and we want them to do human rights impact assessment. But also, do they really care about that? Because if they undo everything that we've changed before, then what are they doing now? Like, are they even engaging? They cut like all the disinformation programs, so they don't even care about that. So with all of that in mind, I think we need to collaboratively think about what kind of social media we want now and how we want to look at that. Like, maybe we can look at it as a means of communication, because of course we're not gonna out of a sudden just close everything and say we don't want to use big tech. It's hard to say that, and even with our communities, like we've been, as activists and human rights defenders, we've been using Signal for a decade maybe, or since it started, but I have to say, my family till now, they use WhatsApp, like they don't use Signal. It's not like lack of information. I've told them about it. I've like a million times, but like WhatsApp is easier for them because all their social network there. So we need to think about, our community, what they are doing, and how we can tell them like repeatedly that we need to change this, and how we can do that together collaboratively, and to explain that once again how this could be done and how is that impacting us. Especially with, like Hassan just now mentioned, how like the whole surveillance system, but also we've seen during this genocide how even WhatsApp collaborated, or like WhatsApp data was leaked to certain surveillance tools where it was utilized there. And after all of that, people are still using WhatsApp. So this is like kind of a shock moment where people need to have like the wake up call, like, no, we need to change, we need to look at other things to be using that, and how can we also look at our role in that as like human rights at the front lines, and how we can work collaboratively with our communities on that. So I'm not gonna say we want to do 1, 2, 3, 4 with the social media platforms. We do have, like, with our policy brief, we have, like, we put the recommendations because it speak about them. But I think we need also to think about all the chain, how this chain is feeding into each other, and how it's a system that we need to think, okay, we need to look at where the actual power is, like our people, and how this power could be transformed into action, and how we can do more on that front, because that's what matters, especially in this time, like time where everyone like can see how also the power of people is coming together, like especially in grieving moment, speaking together and communicating together. I think that is a crucial starting point to think about what we need to do. And then we need to look at other platforms and how we can utilize the other platforms. Like now, like there's a Blue Sky. We don't know what's gonna happen with Blue Sky in 10 years, because we were defending Twitter and now we are like in a messy place. But I think we need to think about what other options that we have and we could utilize for our organizing and mobilizing purposes, so we can keep the work that we are doing without leaving all the digital spaces. And with all of that in mind, we also need to look at like how we are governing those spaces, where we don't want to see this battle as a battle of only people who are doing the actual policy work. It matters for everyone. It matters for the journalists, it matters for the public policy people, it matters for the humanitarian workers, and for everyone. So we need to think also intersectionally and collaboratively how digital rights is everyone's rights, and how everyone should be involved in that kind of work, so they can be also on the front line when we speak about that. As long as we are fragmented and separated because, they are taking down the journalist content, we will achieve the purpose of divide and conquer that usually social media platforms are taking as an approach. We need to come together with a strong mindset that we are a collective and we need to do something about this and to work toward that. It's hard to say that in the Swana region when we see also our political system, because there's no system actually to start with. So I'm not gonna say it's a pinky word, but it's something that we need also to think about and to think how we can do that together in a collective way and in an inspiring way. It's not gonna be impossible because we've done that before. I still recall moments from 2010 and 2011, and to me that was like a time that we need to work more to rebuild like a momentum toward that, but without relying on the US infrastructure. We need to look at what other things that we want to, so we can work toward or to achieve what we want actually.
Yeah, I was going to ask both of you if you wanted to add.
I wanted to add something because I've been thinking about my answer as well, about what the role of a journalist is. And I think for myself, what good journalism is to me, it gives people the language to analyze a moment that's happening. And so I remember I was sitting at a cafe with a Lebanese academic and intellectual named Ziad Majid, and he started to talk to me about how beyond genocide, there are a number of other terms that are present for the current moment: herbicide, domicide, etc., etc. And that stuck with me a lot. And then last year, when the destruction of the Beirut southern suburbs was happening, the word came to mind again, that this wasn't a herbicide and a domicide. It wasn't just, it was the destruction of a place where people live, where people create memories, what people call home. And so being able to have that language helped me to kind of communicate that to a wider audience. And then I saw other people start to use that language as well. And so I think that when we're talking about or trying to understand what's happening, one of the things that we want to do is be able to dissect things and give people the kind of language to talk about the circumstances happening around the world, but sometimes even their own circumstances, right? Sometimes you're able to see something that's happened to you more clearly through having read something that is able to break that down.
Thank you, Justin. I'm gonna just see if the audience has any questions, so that to know how we're gonna direct the conversation.
Thank you guys so much. This has been wonderful. I want to pick up on something that Qassam mentioned and then Mona mentioned, which is Israel's use of WhatsApp and other forms of social media amid the genocide in Gaza and the war in Lebanon last year. I think something we saw consistently was the Israeli use of Twitter and other social medias to issue evacuation orders, whether in Gaza or in the southern suburbs of the group, in Tahrir, and very often in the middle of the night, or with actual misinformation where they would issue evacuation orders and then they would strike somewhere else outside of that zone. Can you talk a little bit more about A, how this impacts folks on the ground and kind of what are the felt impacts of this type of abuse of social media by Israeli authorities, and then because of kind of the aim of the event on narrative, I was wondering if you can also comment on how you think Israel uses this tactic in its own narratives in both of these situations.
I could start, maybe.
Yeah, thank you guys. I have a question probably for Justin, but anyone can weigh in. One of the things that you kind of hinted to in what you were discussing but didn't address is the sort of reckoning of the role, the harmful role that Western journalism has played in moments of conflict. I think most clearly in Gaza, but it also occurs in other places in the region as well. And I'm wondering, to the degree that you can, from your perspective, what does this reckoning look like? We see people starting to call it out on social media. We see a little bit of reporting on the impact of this. We've seen reporting on kind of the New York Times and the way they decide on headlines and stuff like that, some naming and shaming, but we haven't really seen a change or an impact. And I'm wondering what role maybe journalists can play in pushing their outlets to do better. And maybe on the flip side, I'm wondering what it feels like for some of these journalists who maybe are Arab or are connected to these issues and they feel kind of gaslit by the outlets that represent them every day.
Okay, I'm gonna start and then I give it to Qassam. But I think with the evacuation warnings, it's a bit tricky because Justin just said that they have been repeatedly checking or fact checking when the same person is spreading disinformation. So technically, they're giving him one more time, every single time. In the case of the evacuation warnings, many of the evacuation warnings in Gaza, they were telling people, yeah, just go to Rafah and it's safe there. And we were like, my friend was in Rafah and I was calling her, are you even safe? She's like there's no way to be safe here because they are just like bombing 100 meters in front of the tent that I am sitting in, which is to me scary. So there was no safe place. And all those, like to start with, all the evacuation warning were kind of spreading disinformation so they can, again, mass targeting people on the ground. And this is something that we've seen in Gaza repeatedly. We've spoken with our people. We were just like fact checking on the ground, like now, like are you even safe? She's like, they are just bombing now. So there is no way to think about it. Now, the crazy thing is social media platforms, they did started something, this content may be disinforming during COVID. They've never put that on any piece of evacuation warnings, although there has been repeatedly as like well documented like misinforming evacuation warnings. The other thing is, with all the dynamic that we've mentioned, I have to say this out loud. I think even with social media platforms, there is usually also a question about how they are allowing certain spokespersons to keep spreading and justifying targeting civilians in Gaza and in other places. The IDF page on the different social media channels, Afikhai Afrili, which is the Arabic the spokesperson in Arabic for the Israeli page, and Netanyahu's page, were spreading all the time different videos on how they are bombing certain civilians areas, certain civilians places in Gaza, by justifying, like they would just, we found, as he said, we found a military, a tunnel under this. Like there are tunnels under all of Gaza, so you're gonna wipe out Gaza as they actually did. So they have been using all those to justify every single attack that they have done. Now, later on, when the ICJ also put Netanyahu and the other minister on the list, social media platforms didn't even think about banning them from having digital presence on social media, and on the opposite side, on the contrary, they were allowed to continue spreading their propaganda, their disinforming content, and even their hate speech, hateful content. So if we look at it, it's unfair equation from all angles, from all sides. So I think we should keep questioning that, but I think we need to keep in mind that it's unfair all the time from whichever angle that you are looking at it.
Yeah, it's as Mona said, it's problematic on so many different levels. You know, when you're talking about evacuation orders, you know, you basically have no other choice but evacuate. It's a risk that, you know, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna try to escape that area that they're saying that they're gonna bomb? Or are you just gonna work under the pretext that it's just a tactic that they're using? So there's that. There's also the layer of timing. As you mentioned, you know, it happens sometimes at a very late hour, or like the span between the evacuation and the attack itself is so short, so, you know, people have no time to escape. And also, you know, the tools and the mediums that this is communicated through, you know, not everyone has access to Facebook, or not everyone has access to Twitter. And also, there's another layer that some people at times, you know, they basically have no access to the internet at that time. So, you know, when we're thinking about it, there's multiple layers to it, and as Muna said, you know, we've worked on this, and I know that a lot of partners have worked on this, and, you know, we've reported this to a lot of social media platforms and companies, but no action has been taken. So, you know, what options do we have here? I think this leads me back again to the point that Justin has mentioned earlier, is we need to keep documenting this. We need to, you know, archive these posts, you know, whether it's evacuation or whether it's, you know, smear campaigns against journalists. You know, we've reported a lot of the hate campaigns that have been targeted Anas Sharif, and, you know, we know where that led to. So we need to continue documenting those, archiving those posts, because, you know, we also see sometimes that some of the posts that have been posted like a year or 2 years ago are suddenly deleted. So we need to collect as much evidence as possible to then seek accountability on this.
Sorry. Yeah, I wanna add one or two things to that. When we talk about connecting patterns to this as well, I think we need to ask: is it, you know, what kind of war are we talking about when one side can warn the other enemy that they need to evacuate, right? So having some logic in that. And I think the other thing is that, as has been documented, AI is often used in these sort of target banks and databases that are finding targets. And so what we found in Lebanon, for example, was that sometimes the targets were not precise, which adds another layer to this whole thing. May, you had a few things to your question. So what is the reckoning in Western media? I'm not sure if there really has been one, to be honest. You know, we've seen shifts at different times, but then certain patterns play out again, and we go back to the start. And we saw that how, you know, more critical reporting was coming out of Israel until they decided to unilaterally attack Iran, and then suddenly, you know, European officials everywhere in media fell in line again, kind of playing out the same pattern. So I think until there is actually kind of a structural reform in a lot of these media organizations, we actually don't see it going we see it going in kind of the opposite direction, right? Where big name, very wealthy, often billionaires, are, like in the case of Washington Post, we have Jeff Bezos, among others, who are buying media outlets and then interfering in how they do the coverage. So, you know, there's been a reckoning in the sense of how maybe trust, right? There's been a breakdown in trust. I've been to a few different places this year, and when I introduce myself and say that I work for Jazeera, usually people under the age of 40 are quite excited and say that's the only, if we're talking in English, it's the only thing I can watch anymore, it's the only thing I can listen anymore. And that comes with problems as well, right? Because you should get your media from multiple different places to have a good feel of different issues. So that breakdown in trust is going to have different effects going forward. People are getting their information from various influencers, from people speaking on the internet. That obviously opens up a whole new issue when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, sometimes oversimplification of narratives. Palestine as a as a litmus test can, if we're talking about Syria, for example, right? For a long time, there were people who were introduced to politics through Palestine and then followed many of these kind of influencers and would follow the same kind of dynamics in places like Lebanon or Syria where there's different sort of dynamics happening. So I think these are all issues that could accelerate going forward. What can journalists do? I mean, this is a really tricky one, right? There's the possibility of building independent collectives, of going independent. Of course, everything is turning into the gig economy, and this is also a big problem. Personally speaking, from colleagues that I know, there's a lot of discontent. There's a lot of frustration, especially those who work for Western outlets. People who work for news wires or major Western papers. A lot of frustration, a lot of especially those who have Arab backgrounds are feeling really disenfranchised. They feel spoken over. They feel left behind. And I've talked to people who say that they really badly want to quit, but they also feel like if they quit, if they take that big stand, management will just kind of say, okay, moving on, replace them with somebody else and kind of carry on. So you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. I think still going forward, we have to keep looking for alternatives. We probably have to build a lot of our own alternatives. That's not easy in this economic, the current economic situation. It's not easy in the current media situation. But I think those are the places where we're going to have to do this, maybe through loose collectives, independent media works, of course. The more that we can do in media institutions as well, and there are some initiatives that are happening kind of behind closed doors. I know of different cases where, and it's really an individual thing where certain individuals will get together in an organization, have meetings on their own time to try to influence management. Simply, and we're talking about the case of Palestine here, it's simply to apply the same standards that you apply to Palestine that you apply to everywhere else, right? Like that's a very low bar. But I don't like to end on kind of like a nihilistic or like a negative position. Yeah, right. But I want to push through. There's always hope. There's always something you can do. Essentially, we can't give up, and we have to just kind of keep pushing. I think the truth is there. There's global momentum. There's a lot of opportunity. There's an audience, right? Like, there's an audience who wants this sort of work, who wants honest work, who wants good journalism, in English, accessible to Western communities and in other languages as well. We've seen big movements in places like Italy and places like Spain. There's massive protests in France and around the rest of the world. So yeah, I'll stop there. But I think that there is opportunity, and as soon as the kind of right infrastructure comes along and the right sort of outlets can come around and play on that, I think you will see positive reactions and positive benefits to that.
I just want to say one thing, read the media. I think also the past 2 years, give us the shock, not only about the role of media, but also about how people were relying all the time on people on the ground. They were our eyes. I think how people were following Bisan and are following Hind Khudari and Balestia before she left, and all the others, they were, I know some of them now also working with different, technically with Al Jazeera, but even before, I don't think people started following them because they work with Al Jazeera. The way how people are following them, they are following them because they are that source of news. So this takes us back to the connectivity issue. Like, we need connectivity all the time, so we can follow that. We can follow what people on the ground want to report and how they want to inform us about the situation on the ground. And by that, it won't be a negative note, it will be a positive one, because like, I've seen those women as an inspiring model all the time. When I was texting Hind or Bisan at any point and I was getting like their responses and how they are doing, I know it's heartbroken, like it was never a good situation, but at least we are hearing what they are saying and the kind of narrative that they want to say. And I've seen a lot of MEPs and a lot of policymakers, they are following them. So because they are like, there is a big awareness, I think, or a decent awareness, I would say, around the mainstream media. Now people are also aware that they need to follow people on the ground to hear what they are saying and how they are describing the situation. So that's make it alternatively a little bit better, but it's not a solution, a complete solution for what we want to say.
Definitely, and thank you for giving these examples of people who are on the ground that are being followed by so many, many of them are journalists anyway, and they're using those social media platforms as a way to share what is happening exactly. But this brings me to a question for, I'm not going to turn it negative, but solutions. Because most of their audience are on social media platforms. And you do have also websites or TV, but people aren't reading the way they used to. People aren't checking websites necessarily just to read articles. We're a minority of people who do that just because, I don't know, I think we're getting older. But because of that information being spread on social media platforms, there are a lot of shadow bans. Whenever someone wants to amplify these voices, we feel stuck and like cut off, and the access, even those who would want to follow this aren't getting access to it. So is there anything that we could think of or do to just try to tackle this so that we can still amplify those voices? Because it's happening for Gaza, but it's really happening for Sudan. Whenever we share anything about Sudan, there's no views anymore, and it's just, is there anything that we can do?
I think it's a big restriction, and this is a big question, because there is nothing magical that now we're gonna do and it's gonna solve it. Like the shadow banning, we have been speaking about it since 2020, 2021, and since then the companies have been in denial. Sometimes they are speaking about demotions, and now also with all the changes, and even with the changes in the EU, because they are like Google overnight last month, they took down 7 years of archival for all the election and political narrative on their platforms in the EU because of all the legislation that have been ongoing there. So I think it's hard to say, yes, I do have a solution. And I know some people are passionate and they would be saying, yeah, we do collaboration. I think there are some tactics that people are using that make the situation a little bit better, but they are not solving it. I tested like technically different tools, like the collaboration with certain pages worked, but it wasn't magical because it kept the shadow banning on my account. I am personally shadow banned, so it kept the shadow banning, but the post that I put out, the reachability of the post was 1 million or something in overnight. So it sorted the problem, because my problem, like I'm still shadow banned, but I was at least able to say what I wanted to say. 1 million people viewed that. It's good. I don't want anything else at this moment. But I think it's a question for the companies, because companies are not looking for solutions for that. They are doing it on purpose, and I don't think they're aiming to end that. And now, with all the changes in the governance and how they are like depoliticizing the platforms and having it as more entertainment platforms, it's not strange to reach this point. So I don't think there is, to me, magical solution for it. I don't know if Qassam or Justin would say.
Yeah, I also don't think that there's like a magical solution, and as Mona said, they don't really want a solution. Like even if you come to them and present them with a solution, they're not gonna do it. So I think that leaves us with very limited few options. Documenting and trying to build a case every time, every case that this happens. Sheikh Jarrah, Gaza, Sudan, wherever this happens, we need to keep documenting, and we need to keep documenting, and we need to keep documenting. Thinking about new tools. What tools do we really want to use moving forward? We've seen how these tools have been used. Not to our advantage, but used against us and against our people. And we really need to start thinking about the new tools that we want to use to advocate and to talk about the problems and the things that we want to talk about. And at the same time, we need to think about new strategies. Talking to them, sending private letters. It worked in some cases and at certain times, but then with the current political situation, that's not something that we can do, and that's not something that we should be spending as much of our time and as much of our effort onto. So we really need to think strategically and creatively with each other on what new pressure points do we really want to hit this time, because we know what hurts them the most, and that's their pockets. So yeah, we need to continue thinking more and more about that.
I would say outside of the social space, because I think the golden age of social media, where everybody was there and we met our friends and comrades there, is kind of over. I think we have to politicize everything, and you have to take things very local. And so I think one way we can start with this, and this is something that won't have immediate effects, but to get on the ground locally in your community, build collectives and do that sort of work. And this is something that Sudan was doing before the war, right? Where you had these local coordination committees. Syria had a history of that as well at certain times. And so I think that the more connected we are on the interpersonal level, without relying on these sort of technologies that can be co-opted, the more powerful we are, and the more we can kind of control our surroundings. And if we build that into habits, and it's very difficult in this economy and in this information ecosystem, but I'm a strong believer that we need to kind of do the work beyond what is happening online. And there's a lot of obviously brilliant work happening in those spaces, but also to get on the ground and to do stuff in the real world. One thing I want to point out, because I was speaking to a Palestinian lawyer a couple of months ago, and on the sense of documentation, in addition to these companies just removing stuff, because of shadow bans, people have started to use alternative spellings of things and punctuation, and this also leads to kind of a difficulty for archiving or for searching in the past, right? So in a sense, with this person, their theory was that at some point there will be an effort to kind of reshape the history that we've all lived and seen, and that's quite scary because it's something that can be possible, and so that's why archiving and keeping things is important. I might shift a bit here in a sense, but I was having a different conversation that was with a friend of mine who was talking about how a lot of his friends now have kids that are in their teen years, and they don't own things, like they don't own anything, right? They don't own CDs, they don't own DVDs, they've never had any of these things. You have Spotify, you have Netflix, and you have whatever. But what that means is that when this system goes down, you suddenly are left with nothing. And then how do you listen to music, and how do you engage with culture, and that's the same for politics and social media and for connection. And so I think that what we have to start thinking about as well is a shift back into what you can get your hands on, and how that can, because that can also have an effect. We've seen these mass marches through various cities, and this had an impact. This had an impact. The college protests in the United States had an impact, and that grew and that manifested into things that had a real world impact in terms of policymakers deciding, okay, we have to at least say something now because there's pressure on us. So I would propose that anyone who cares about any of these issues, think about what can you do, what can you do online, and what pressure can you put, and where is their money, and then also what can you do in outside of these spaces and in the real world as well.
This comes in handy since we have those 3 days of us just connecting and being around each other with bread and net. So I'm gonna end this with that note. Thank you so much for attending the event. Thank you so much, Mona, Justin, and Qassam. It's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation